Welcome to Rcast, the official podcast of the RChain Cooperative. RChain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. Beyond our platform, our investment partners, Reflective Ventures and Pythia, fund organizations that are working within our core mission statement to create a better world by enabling social coordination in robust, secure, and scalable ways. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for RChain. Each week on Rcast, I'll be talking with the founders of our portfolio companies, as well as co-op members, staff, and other figures in the RChain ecosystem about the most pressing issues in blockchain today. Please check out rchain.coop to learn more about the platform, our community, our validator sale, and information on becoming a member. Today I'm talking with Chris Boscolo, the founder of LifeID, an open-source tokenized protocol for self-sovereign identity. I recorded our conversation shortly before news came out about the latest Facebook hack. But needless to say, digital identity and online security are extremely important to all of us. We are just now coming to realize the cost of blindly signing up for any and every service without reading the fine print. And forget about trying to keep all of your passwords organized. Chris is working on a multifaceted platform that will give you power over what information companies, organizations, and governments are able to view and, if all goes well, do away with the password process entirely by using biometrics. I got to spend time with Chris at Archon 3 in Berlin, and he's truly an easygoing, friendly guy who makes for great conversation, as you'll hear in this podcast. The potential for LifeID to integrate into numerous other dApps and platforms will be a tremendous evolution in digital identity in coming years. I hope you enjoy this discussion as much as I did talking with Chris. You founded LifeID after being a VP at Optimum Energy for over 4 years. What need did you see that was not being fulfilled in your industry that led you to create LifeID?
Oh, great question. So first off, previous to my job at Optimum, I spent most of my career working in internet security. So I'm very familiar with the issues surrounding using a digital identity, logging into websites, creating VPNs, and all of those sorts of things. There were really three elements or three different problems that sort of came together in wanting to create LifeID. And they range from sort of one hand convenience all the way to more serious issues surrounding personal information. And so there was one event, and this just deals with convenience in the real world. I was traveling to Europe one year, and I just wanted to travel light. So I wanted to take just my iPhone as opposed to my iPhone and this 2-inch thick wallet. And so I started going through my wallet, trying to figure out everything in my wallet that could be moved to my iPhone in some way, shape, or form. And I realized outside of those things that were payment related, most of them related to proof of identity, physical proofs of identity. Sometimes they were loyalty cards, which aren't necessarily identity related, but still you're presenting a token of representation of who you are to some particular online or in-store facility. That was sort of the one component of the LifeID story. The second one dealt with our transactions online. I was helping my wife try to print some photos. She was putting together a board where she wanted to send some photos to an online site and print them. And we were experimenting with 2 or 3 different sites and a few that she had used before. And through this process, for each site we encountered, she either hadn't used it for a while or whatnot and had to reset her password. And as we were going through this process, near her desk is this Post-it cards of all of these passwords for all of these sites she used. And it's just super inconvenient for anyone that's using passwords in the real world, unless they're tech savvy and they use a password manager or whatnot. This idea that we have a username and password for every one of these sites that we use is just horribly inconvenient. And furthermore, it's also somewhat insecure because inevitably what happens is that people use passwords that are easily guessed. And so each one of these sites becomes sort of a trove for hackers to break into using password cracking software and whatnot. And then the third more serious component to the Life ID story is that which deals with our personal information and companies and organizations using and selling our personal information without our consent. And this was made evident on numerous stories over the last couple of years. We have the Equifax break-ins, which was the most egregious, where lots of people's personal information was sold. But then you have things like Facebook Analytica, where we realize as we use internet sites are handing over personal information that others are selling and profiting from without necessarily our consent. And so that was the third part of wanting to create an identity solution where users remained in control of their private information, as opposed to pushing it all into these centralized troves where hackers could break in and sell it on the black market.
We're in a time where not many people read the fine print. I know when I sign up for a new app, the idea of reading 30 pages of legalese is not going to happen. How seriously do you think that people take their online identities? Or do you think that people just throw up their hands and say, well, that's part of it?
That's a great question. And I honestly think the answer varies quite greatly depending on, how old you are, what generation you're from. There's definitely the younger generation that grew up using social media since they were in, early grade school or middle school, that I would say is in the category of just throwing their hands up and honestly don't care too much about it. And as you move up through the generations, and this is my anecdotal, just in chatting with people, this is not necessarily backed by any studies or anything, but it seems as though those that have lived in a world pre-internet seem to be more concerned about these issues surrounding privacy and as you say, the fine print of some of these websites that we use. There's a mix. There are definitely those that I think have thrown their hands up. And then there are those that still do care. As we continue to see the news stories of the scenarios where people are being exploited, more and more people are made aware of the problem and kind of put themselves in the camp of caring again. I don't think this is a problem that's going to go away, even as the younger generations start to become the majority of the population.
What sort of learning curve or application needs to happen for a Life ID to be accepted and used by Facebook, Instagram, any of these social media sites, news sites, and so on? Does it require adoption by each singular organization or company?
Yeah, so let me address the learning curve side of that and then the adoption side of that. So on the learning curve, we want to tackle that problem with awesome user experience. So the idea is that people will want to use a Life ID approach because the user experience is better than the previous approach of needing to remember usernames and passwords. And every transaction that you do will be done with, mobile app or your web browser in such a way that it is just very fluid and convenient for you, the user. But also, one of the things that we do with our user experience is reinforce the data exchange, if you will, those parts of your private data that you're offering to the other party in that particular transaction. And so every time you use, or I should say, every time you create a new relationship, you get to make a decision about how much of your personal data you want to divulge. So the user experience will, we're targeting it to be better than the existing one. So we think adoption will be, or we think that learning curve will be very, very shallow. There won't be a steep learning curve. Now, on the adoption side, that's a really good question. And yes, absolutely, the businesses will need to adopt this model of identity one by one. The two areas or the two ways that we want to help push this adoption is, first of all, that user experience side is important. If onboarding new users is simpler and more convenient than the existing methods, then all of the sites that are currently trying to onboard users will see that as a benefit and will move to this new identity model that LifeID is based on. In addition to that, I want to also bring up that this paradigm of user-controlled identity is one that's not just being pushed by LifeID. There are number of other people that are working on this. And so each one of these projects, and it comes under the term self-sovereign identity. And so each one of the projects that are building technology for self-sovereign identity and that are signing up government agencies and other organizations to use this paradigm for identity is going to help on the adoption side of things. So that LifeID is one of several projects that's pushing this new paradigm for identity. So we see that making it less friction for the onboarding of new users being important for that adoption, and then just as a whole, the industry moving in this direction primarily for reasons of compliance. And if you think of, for example, GDPR, trying to have online architectures that are privacy centered so that users' privacy and user data is easier to manage for businesses. Those will be the drivers sort of on the industry side pushing adoption.
I should add that personally, I think this is a great idea. We met personally in Berlin a few weeks ago at Archon 3. The first night there, I was a bit jet lagged, and I wake up at 1 a.m. and I realize that my passport is missing.
Oh my goodness.
And so from 1 to 4 in the morning, I'm freaking out on the phone with my wife back in Los Angeles, online, figuring out where to go, what I need to do, realizing that half of my time in Berlin is going to be spent dealing with the US Embassy and trying to get these documents in place. And then at 4 a.m., I remembered that all the years I lived in New York, I found a number of people's wallets. Whenever that happened, I would log onto Facebook immediately to see if I could find them, and every time I did and was able to get their wallets back to them. And so at 4, it dawns on me to log on to Facebook, and I do, and there you go. The waiter at the restaurant I had eaten at that last night had emailed me there saying, "I have your passport."
Wow.
I consider myself very lucky having had that happen. That said, the fact that it would have taken so much work for me to prove my identity to the government brings up another question. We've talked a little bit about organizations and companies signing on to a platform like LifeID, but have you addressed governments accepting this form of identification?
So that is a great question, and absolutely. So there's a couple sides to that question. One is in our conversations with a lot of government officials in the states. We're located in the state of Washington, and in the United States, there's both state regulated, like driver's license, and then there's federal regulated, like your passport. Most of the government officials we've talked to want to see traction in the business first before they would try to adopt the technology for government. But they absolutely are open to that. In fact, those conversations are already started. The second thing I'll say to that is there are actually some governments that are pushing this new identity model. For example, up in Vancouver, Canada, they're piloting a project where they're starting with business licenses and using the business identity as the first thing that will go in this new identity paradigm, where the government can issue the license in a form of a verified credential to that business. It's important to note with LifeID that the identity architecture is not just for individuals, it also is for organizations. So organizations will have identities just as individuals will have identities, because half of our relationships are with other organizations. So they need to also have, credentials and ways to prove that they are who they say they are. We see that the government adoption of LifeID is really the holy grail, because then your passport experience is way different in a scenario where you've got technology like LifeID. So instead of panicking because you don't know where your passport is, first of all, if you have a LifeID based passport, it's on your phone instead of a separate piece of document. So if you still had your phone, you wouldn't have even panicked. But there's still the scenario of, oh my goodness, I left my phone in the cab, on the way back to the hotel. and you lost your phone. And so in that scenario, you need to have the ability to recover your ability to use your Life ID on a new phone when you get it. And that's precisely where we've been concentrating a lot of our effort is this, how do we make it easy for individuals to recover the use of their identity for things like a passport? And so that's exactly the scenario that we are, focusing on in terms of just making it easy. So you get a new phone, you walk through the steps to recover the keys that represent you for that passport, and then you can use your new phone to show the airport officials your passport as you board the plane.
Outside of technology, I've spent the last 6 years working as a health and science journalist, where one of my focuses is neuroscience. And when you're discussing our brain, inevitably you come across consciousness studies. For a long time, it was believed that we had a fixed identity, and it wasn't until the 1970s that neuroplasticity really received mainstream scientific acceptance. Now we know that identity is a fluid concept, but here we're talking about digital identity. And interestingly, the more and more we become integrated with our technology, the more the line between organic and digital identities are being blurred. This is something in many capacities that you have entertained with your company, especially in regards to the concept of self-sovereignty.
Yeah, absolutely. I call that not the last mile problem, but the last inch problem, which is we very much rely on the phone's biometric capabilities to prove that you're the one unlocking the keys that represent your identity. At the end of the day, a digital identity is represented as cryptographic keys. And so the way that you prove ownership of them is that you build a system where only you can have access to the cryptographic keys that represent you. And that unlocking of those cryptographic keys is done with the biometrics on the phone.
You obviously take this very seriously. You have even a self-sovereign Bill of Rights. And you also write about the 3 pillars of Life ID, and the first one being economic incentives, both the economic incentive of the user, and we also have to discuss your own economic incentives for Life ID.
That's a great question. And by the way, I want to give credit where credit is due on this one in terms of the person that started down this path of self-sovereign identity was a gentleman by the name of Christopher Allen. He actually wrote principles of self-sovereign identity that we built on. It was very, influential in helping us arrive at this idea of self-sovereign identity. He has a GitHub repository where the discussion of refining these elements of these principles is taking place. And it has been going on for the last couple of years. It's very hard to have that starting point of self-sovereign identity, and it does become very philosophical very quickly. But for us, what we were trying to do with our Bill of Rights was lay sort of a framework based on the self-sovereign principles that map to the digital world so that we could concretely build a platform where if you come and use the platform, you could be certain that there are some guarantees about your identity that we would try to preserve in this instantiation of trying to transact your digital identity. And at the heart of it is user agency over their identity and the ability to control who gets to see portions of it and how you prove who you are. It's not entirely in the user's control, obviously. In the real world, we have other people vouch for our identity often, and we do this both consciously and subconsciously. We tend to maybe get introduced to somebody by a friend, and the friend will give us attributes about this person, and then when we go meet them, we will confirm that those attributes matches the person we're talking to ensure that we're indeed dealing with the right person that we got introduced to. Things of that nature. So the Bill of Rights is, as I said, at the heart of it is ensuring that users have agency as it's implemented as a digital platform. So I want to differentiate that we have our Bill of Rights, which is sort of the guiding principle behind the life identity protocol and platform. The three pillars that you're referring to has to do with the blockchain-based identity platform itself. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. It also answers the question, why does blockchain even in the conversation about building an identity platform? Let me start with sort of describing the way that identities are transacted in this new self-sovereign paradigm. So with a self-sovereign paradigm, the user or organization creates an identifier that they want to use to represent themselves in a relationship. And so that's a step that they are in control of. But they need a way to communicate this identifier to the other party that they're in a relationship with. So just take a really simple case of logging into a website. So there's some website, maybe it's a site where you go and you can find patterns for cross-stitching or something like that. You know, it's a community of cross-stitchers. And to create an account on that site, I will create a unique identifier that I'm in control of, and I hand it over during that authentication process to that website. They record that identifier, and I prove ownership over that identifier with using the LifeID app. So that identifier actually has to live somewhere that neither I'm in full control of or the website is in full control of, because it's a coordinating point for us to have this relationship. The question is, if you're building a self-sovereign identity platform where users are in full control of their identity, where can you store these identifiers that don't fall in under the control of one organization? And this is where the blockchain comes in. This is where it is the perfect platform where everybody can go to one blockchain to look up these identifiers and use them to coordinate the relationships they're creating with all the parties, where no one person owns the blockchain. Everybody that uses the blockchain ends up owning the blockchain. So the three pillars that you're referring to is a blog article that I wrote at the beginning of the year that sort of outlines what are the attributes that this platform, this blockchain-based platform, needs to have to preserve this self-sovereign model where users have agency over these identifiers. And so the first one is, as you mentioned, the economic incentive. And the economic incentive in the context of this platform are that the platform has to exist in the real world in perpetuity. And there's real world costs associated with compute infrastructure, right? And so as people use the blockchain, there needs to be enough economic incentive to do these transactions, to pay the blockchain actors to run this platform. And different blockchains have different ways of doing this, right? So for example, in Ethereum, the Ethereum miners are the ones that get paid for executing Ethereum transactions. We happen to be using Archain. Archain is a proof of stake model. So the validators in the Archain blockchain are the ones that need to be paid for the transactions to take place. And so that's the first pillar of this identity platform, is the economic incentive has to exist for those nodes to run the smart contracts that represent the identity layer for everyone to use. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is, because it's an identity platform where where users are in full control of their identity, we need to ensure that there's no source of censorship that can be introduced. And so the second pillar is that this platform needs to be open. That is, anybody that has a computer, because it's a digital platform, should be able to join and use this platform. And so there's another word that's used, which is permissionless, which basically says anybody can join, and they can join either as a validator, you know, a node that is verifying the transactions, or just an end user. But either way, there can't be a restriction on who can join. It needs to be open and permissionless. And then the open and permissionless concept extends to also the architecture and how the data is handled. So we believe that for a digital identity to be self-sovereign, you as the end user need to be able to export all of your data from whatever application you're using so that you can move to a different application if you find that the one you're using is either not meeting your needs, or perhaps the software is becoming led by people that want to manipulate it to maybe profit from the data that they're capturing about you. So we want to keep it open so that you can take your data and port it to any app that allows you to transact your identity. So that's the second pillar, the open and permissionless. And then the third one is that this platform has to have a governance model that is ultimately controlled by the identity holders. And this is, what I said is kind of one of the more interesting parts of what's going on in blockchain right now is, as a blockchain platform, a blockchain project, how is the software that represents the blockchain governed? And this is, I say it's interesting because there's a lot of different models that are being thought through. Archain has a really interesting co-op model for the governance of the Archain software. With LifeID, we want to ensure, so we see the identity layer as kind of a substrate that lives on top of the blockchain, but it needs to be agnostic of the blockchain. In other words, we want to preserve the ability for the identity holders to ensure the identity platform will serve them. And that might mean moving from one blockchain to another if the underlying blockchain goes in a direction that doesn't serve the needs of the identity platform. And so that's why we believe that the identity layer that kind of lives on top of the blockchain needs to have its own governance where the stakeholders are the identity holders themselves.
And how will LifeID monetize the platform?
Yeah, so well, first off, I do want to clarify that LifeID is the platform, the foundation, much like a foundation that launches a blockchain itself. The people that profit are the people that are building the applications on top of the platform. And so we have a company that will build for a couple tools on top of the platform. One, for example, like one very common tool that people need to do is a process known as Know Your Customer. So we're building, this is just one application we're building called KYC, which is Know Your Customer process. And so we will monetize the same way a software company monetizes using their software. So when people use our KYC process, we will collect a fee from that process. We don't necessarily monetize use of the platform itself. It is a blockchain platform, and there's the use of the platform pays for the platform itself, just in the same way that Ether pays for the Ethereum platform, or Rev will pay for the Archain platform. And so we will build tools on top of the platform and sell software as a service tools for people that are using, the platform for various identity applications. And that's how we as a company will make money. But we envision there being there's going to be a whole ecosystem of companies doing this. So the platform itself needs to exist outside of any company. There's no one company that owns the platform. It's a blockchain-based platform. There's a foundation that's going to launch it, the LifeID Foundation, and it is owned by the collective, right? The people that use it. So companies that live on top of it will be able to make money by selling tools that use the platform. And one other point on that is that we're building in the ability for, so let's say you make a wallet, for example, that uses the platform. As part of the smart contracts, your wallet will be able to, that you use to transact on the platform, part of the transaction fee will go to the wallet maker themselves. So that's how the actual money can flow using the token for that wallet maker to make their money.
Let's play everybody's favorite game. A little bit of speculation here. Very prevalent in all of these communities surrounding technology. How long until there is mass adoption on a mainstream level of blockchain?
Oh man. I love the speculation questions. So, and this is going to sound like a cop out. I'll say by analogy, the promises that I remember hearing. So I was involved in some .com startup during the internet boom, and I remember the promises made back in, this is like in the mid 90s, right? Where people said things like, my refrigerator is going to have an IP address. There are all these outlandish claims about what the internet was going to be and do. And frankly, it took 20 years. Like we're just now, today my refrigerator still doesn't have an IP address. But there are some washing machines that do, right? And they send a note to Amazon, your Amazon account, to order more soap when it's out of soap. That this speculation is kind of interesting. So first off, I think the technology of blockchain is as revolutionary for the world as the internet was 25 years ago or more, if you go back to the early days of the internet, but really sort of the explosion of the dot-com era of the internet. We're going to see, as you said, adoption of blockchain 20 years from now. We're going to be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that nobody thought of this use case of the blockchain. It'll be the one that dominates. How long will it take? So if you use the internet as an analogy, I think we're still at least a decade away for seeing mass adoption of blockchain, which is maybe not what most people want to hear. Although we have the internet now, which is accelerating our information exchange. So I think it's going to go faster than the actual internet itself exploded. But at the same time, we're in this, I feel like we're still in the early days. I still feel like, our chain is sort of a Gen 3 blockchain, and we're looking at an R-Chain launch first quarter of 19, right? So we're still in the early days of even creating the software that is blockchain.
Maybe I'm being a little bit selfish because I'm rooting for R-Chain and all of the platforms building on top of us. I see it a little bit quicker, especially when you have the Intercontinental Exchange getting into the game. You're starting to see some signs of regulations. You're seeing Microsoft and Starbucks throw their hat into the ring. Bank of America has most patents on blockchain than anyone. It'll be interesting to see the difference between the decentralized public and private blockchains that are going to emerge, but the technology itself, I too was in San Francisco in 97. I had moved after graduating from Rutgers, but I had my ambitions of being a print journalist. And when I was getting all of my jobs in tech, I decided to move back to the East Coast to pursue that dream, which worked out for a while. I mean, it was great, but I've obviously moved into digital forms of media. That said, I think it's going to be a little bit quicker.
Yeah. And just to maybe back my answer up or back it off a little bit, I'm thinking through the identity use cases in particular in answering that question. I think there will be blockchain use cases, as you just mentioned, that will see adoption on a much more rapid timescale. But we talked about, for example, that passport user scenario. It's hard for me to imagine. I hope I'm wrong on this, but it's hard for me to imagine the U.S. federal government using a digital passport based on blockchain for, at a minimum, another 6 years. It's hard for me to see a path for it to happen any faster than that. So that's part of what's influencing my sort of decade out projection on adoption. But I think you're right. There's going to be other use cases where adoption happens much more quickly.
Okay, fair enough. From that perspective, I completely agree and understand, especially given this administration. But we don't need to talk about that. That's for a different podcast, I suppose. Tell me how you came into the R-Chain ecosystem to begin with.
I first met Ed and Greg Ed Eichholt and Greg Meredith did a presentation in Seattle. It was a blockchain meetup that was, I want to think it was January timeframe of 17. And that's where I first learned of R-Chain. And I had been doing a tremendous amount of research for Life ID on the underlying blockchain that we would need to build on. One of the things that is critical for an identity platform that wants to scale to the world is that it is built on a blockchain that can scale to the world. And that's where, we looked obviously at, like everyone else, at Ethereum initially, because it also has to be smart contract capable. The two problems that we saw with it were, one, the transaction fees we felt were too high to deliver on what we wanted to deliver for people to create identifiers. And then the scale was also the other concern with Ethereum. And so after that meeting where we saw Greg present on R-Chain, I just started following their progress and reading more about the R-Chain architecture. The mobile process calculus approach was really intriguing, and the correct by construction was also very fascinating from the, ensuring that these smart contracts do what they're supposed to do. That was the initial seed that got planted, and then just through research and trying to uncover, is this the right platform to build on, we, started to learn more and more about the R-Chain. environment. And it also helped, obviously, that they're in our backyard. So a lot of the RChain team is in the Seattle area. So that was very helpful for us because we are also in the Seattle area.
Last question. When is Life ID going to be available in the world?
So we plan on launching, at this point, it will probably be when RChain launches. Our original plan was to launch in Q1 of next year as well. Now that RChain is launching in Q1 of next year, our launch will most likely go live right when the RChain network goes live. That'll be very exciting for us. Between now and then, we are launching our testnet version of Life ID. So we will have the ability for people to start playing with it. And we're doing it in stages in terms of the various components of the Life ID architecture. So like even recently, we just launched what are called the decentralized identifiers. So the library for building or creating the decentralized identifier has now been pushed out. The Life ID architecture, everything about it is open source. So each one of these components will go live as we use GitLab, so it'll be on GitLab. So the live version of Life ID will launch with RChain.